Welcome to Not Another PD, the podcast for helping professionals who are over dull trainings and death by slideshow workshops. I'm Jazmin Pursell, social worker, coach, supervisor, and self-proclaimed boundaries queen. Each week, you'll hear real, honest conversations, sometimes solo, sometimes with expert guests. Think insider perspectives, practical takeaways, and a focus on your well-being, not just how you show up for clients. This podcast is about you, the human behind the caseload, the human behind the profession. So, what are we waiting for? Let's get started. Episode 16. Welcome back for another solo episode. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the myth of the good practitioner or of the good helping professional. We're going to look at where this myth actually comes from and the ways in which this can show up in the work that we do. I'll also use a specific example from my own practice as well as to how this myth of the good practitioner has shown up for me in the past and sometimes can continue to show up as well. First, I wanted to explore what a myth actually is. And a myth, it's not a lie. A myth may not be based on truth, but we shouldn't consider a myth as a lie. And I remember when I was in primary school, I studied Greek. I also learnt a lot about Greek mythology, and I always found it fascinating how these Greek mythical creatures, how these were such a core part of the belief system of ancient Greeks, and that they really believed in these myths. So it certainly for them, it wasn't like believing a lie. It was very much reinforced by those around them. Those around them would have at that time had similar beliefs in these Greek mythical creatures. And similar to in our professions, when myths are sort of reinforced over and over again by those around us, whether it's our colleagues, whether it's our managers, even our organisations, then we continuously reinforce these myths in our practice, and then it can be harder to actually be able to identify our way of thinking about the good practitioner. What does the good practitioner do? How does the good practitioner interact with other colleagues, within their organisation? How does the good practitioner interact with clients? It can be hard to identify some of these narratives that we may have unless we actually identify this as a myth. So that's why I really wanted to talk about myths more generally before we sort of delve a little bit deeper into myths. And myths are really stories that are either explicitly told or more implicitly told. So it could be that your organization has a certain culture around always putting the client first, sometimes to the detriment of practitioner well-being, or it could be something that has been reinforced for you from childhood through school, through university, through your early career as a helping professional. How is the myth of the good practitioner constantly reinforced? And it can be reinforced in, for example, just the excessive workload that we have. And often organisations allocate excessive workloads to their staff without considering what's actually a reasonable and sustainable workload that will allow the practitioner to actually be able to sustain that caseload and not get burnt out and then needing to go on stress leave and just feel really, really overwhelmed. So often these myths are reinforced within organisations as well. Even when I think back to university, when I was studying my Master of Social Work, just a social work degree, the excessive workload, both the course curriculum, but also the 1,000 and largely unpaid clinical placement hours that goes into someone becoming a qualified social worker in Australia. I know it can look different overseas, but it's an excessive workload. It's a 4-year bachelor degree or a 2-year master's degree. That's if you study it full time. I studied part time as I was still working and parenting, and at the time I certainly couldn't afford the financial burden of being a full-time student without any other source of income. So even just the expectations of us during our academic studies can sort of reinforce that myth that we need to keep overgiving to our profession, to everyone else, but then our own well-being is often, comes secondary. So that's what I'm seeing a lot. That's certainly what was my experience when one of the times I'd have experienced burnout and a lot of physical health issues, that I was not even putting myself second. I was putting myself, way, way, way down on, on that kind of hierarchy. So think about how are the institutions, whether it's education systems, health systems, social services, the organizations we work with, and I guess our society as well. Think about how are the ways that these institutions or these systems continuously reinforce that concept of the good practitioner myth or the good helping professional myth. And it certainly showed up for me so many times, but I can think of one time in particular. I'll share my experience with you, and then we'll break down further around what some of these, conditions or requirements of the good practitioner, what they actually kind of look like in practice. But for me, I was working as a primary school social worker. I had not long completed my Master of Social Work, but I had been working in the sector for at least, I'd say, 3 to 4 years prior to becoming a qualified social worker. So I had a lot of previous experience, but I was officially a new graduate social worker. I was the very first social worker that this primary school had hired. So I felt that there was that need to prove myself, to prove the worth, not just of myself as a social worker at that school, but also prove the worth of social work as a professional discipline. It was a huge school, so it had obviously a lot of teaching staff, integration support, and then an admin staff, and then they had a school counsellor, a school psychologist, and me as the school social worker. A lot of the staff, both the teachers but also leadership, were not really familiar with what a social worker does, and were clearly able to articulate, this is the role of a counsellor, this is what a psychologist does. But then when it came to myself as a social worker, they sort of drew a blank. And I'm like, I don't really know what you do. What is it that you do? And how is what you do kind of different to maybe a counsellor? So for me, having to feeling as though I had to constantly be proving my worth, both individually as a new graduate social worker, but also as the very first social worker in that school. And I really kind of started to internalize the narrative of, what does a good social worker do? What do I do? And one of the things that I struggled with was actually saying no to things. So I think because that role clarity of the social worker role, and how is that different from, the integration aides and the other members of the wellbeing team, how my role was very different to theirs, but we can come together and do a lot of collaborative work together. But because there was a lack of, I guess, role clarity around my role and what a social worker does in a primary school, I felt the need, this compulsion to keep proving my worth. So it looked like obsessively signing up to professional learning in my own time as well. So I joined a supervision group for other school social workers. I paid for external supervision because it wasn't something that was provided within my organisation. I was doing just excessive amounts of training and courses, both during school holidays, on my breaks, in the evenings, really to the detriment of my own well-being. And for me, it was about gathering knowledge, just gathering excessive amounts of knowledge, just so if anyone drew upon my expertise in a certain area, I would never have to disappoint anyone and say, I'm not sure, I don't know. Ask the psychologist, ask the counsellor, ask the integration aide, ask the teacher. I just found that I needed to be a one-stop shop if anyone ever called on me, if any staff member or parent ever called on me, because I sort of had this strive for perfection in my role and a strive to really show them my value and prove my value and my worth. And I was also really diligent about coming to work on time. I was never ever late. I saw a lot of staff around me continuously coming in late, but I would even get there really early just to prove that I'm punctual. You can rely on me. There was a time in which we had morning meetings and there were often times that I was the only one on time, but that was one of the ways that the myth of the good practitioner played out for me, was that a good practitioner is on time. They never keep anyone else waiting. They always prioritize everyone else above themselves. Some of the other ways that I internalized when I think back to that role, the myth of the good practitioner, was that I was offering to provide a lot of additional support beyond the scope of my role. That actually became exhausting. If you can relate to this story and you even part of this story, and although this myth isn't a lie, it's like it's a series of beliefs that we hear, that we're exposed to in multiple ways. But then once we internalize these, we start to embody these good practitioner ideals. And then once we take them on, then it's an exhausting process, because then you need to try to unravel yourself from the myth. So that's what that's what I've been doing for the last few years, is actually unraveling that myth, or that stereotype really, of the good practitioner. And it's important to recognize that the myth of the good practitioner does start to, if we allow it, and often it's really subtle, but it then becomes part of our professional identity. And it definitely became part of my professional identity. And then when we embody the myth of the good practitioner, that's also where we struggle to put in boundaries. I really didn't have clear boundaries at all between when my workday ends and when my personal life begins. And the fact that I was doing excessive amounts of professional learning in my own time, instead of actually trying to work within my schedule or within my timetabled hours in the school, when I could actually do some professional learning during my workday, it really does start to chip away at your own personal well-being. And then it's harder to put boundaries in place, such as your finishing time is non-negotiable. During school holidays, that's not a time for you to fill every single day with excessive amounts of training, courses, etc. That's actually time for you to spend, either on holidays, spend time with your family. I had school-age children myself. I think I only had one school-age child at the time. So actually being aware of where we have let our boundaries slip, or where we haven't actually put boundaries in place because we've actually embodied these stereotypical qualities of the good practitioner. So this episode is really just about raising awareness, and when we're aware of it, then we can actually start to debunk this myth and this stereotype. What's the impact? What's the cost? What's the cost to our own well-being? What's the cost to our families? And also, what's the cost to our professional identity if we start to embody this? And really, this myth really is striving for perfection, and it's just incredibly unattainable for any of us to be striving for perfection in any area, whether it's in your work, in your personal life. It's impossible to actually attain perfection, and we'll constantly leave ourselves feeling disappointed and less than if we're striving for perfection in our lives. So we spoke a bit about the myth, where myths come from, and how they can be reinforced in the systems around us. So our organizations, even like our childhood experiences, even from our colleagues. I spoke about a specific example of myself as an early career social worker working in a primary school, and how I was striving for perfection in that role. I was really trying to constantly prove my worth and how exhausting it was, and how that led to me not having a work-life balance, me not putting boundaries in place, and that had significant negative impacts on my well-being. I'll end with a few tips for you that I hope will be helpful. So one of them is, if you're a visual person like me, you could get a little mini whiteboard or like a piece of paper and a pencil or something, and write a list of the qualities of the good practitioner. If you're a counsellor, the good counsellor. What does the good counsellor do? And just write a list of all of these qualities. So this list will then give you a bit of an idea about your own thinking around how this myth shows up for you. So write all of them down on a piece of paper or mini whiteboard. And if you're using a mini whiteboard, then read regardless of whether you're using paper or a mini whiteboard, write your list down of these qualities of the good or the perfect practitioner, the perfect helping professional. Then read your list aloud. And then if you've got a piece of paper, then crumple it up into a ball and throw it in your recycling bin. If you've got a mini whiteboard, then just rub it off with your eraser. That is just an exercise for you to start to acknowledge, yes, these are the qualities that you may have internalized, these beliefs you may have internalized around the good practitioner and how the good practitioner behaves. And then we're doing away with it. So we're either scrunching it up, throwing it in your recycle bin, or rubbing it out with the eraser. And we need to free ourselves from these. So that's one of my big tips. That's a really great activity to do with a lot of different internal beliefs or internal narratives that are not helping us. So get rid of that. And another thing is, I encourage all of you to bring this topic into your supervision sessions, whether it's your supervision sessions within your workplace with your direct supervisor, or whether it's with your external supervisor. If you're a student, then bring these to one of your peers or one of your teachers, one of your lecturers. So I just encourage all of you to bring this conversation into one of these safe spaces. And this is something we can continuously come back to. And I really hope that this has been helpful. If it has been helpful, send me a DM and let me know what your biggest takeaway was, and what is one of those stereotypes about the good practitioner that you're now aware of that you have just totally thrown aside and will never allow it to have any power over you again. Thank you so much for listening to Not Another PD. If today's episode resonated with you, share it with a colleague who could use stronger boundaries, less burnout, and more balance. And don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, keep saying yes less.